Hi folks, Howard here and welcome back into my studio again. This time we're looking at the four main techniques that we need to learn to paint in loose style watercolour. Well, to paint in any watercolour style for that matter. And those four techniques are wet on dry, wet in wet, dry in wet and dry on dry. Now in the previous the video that accompanies this one, we looked at the tools and materials that I use and why I use them: brushes, paints, palettes, etc. So what we're doing here is we're moving on to the next stage, which is really learning how to control our paint. So stay tuned. Hope you enjoy this and I'll see you on the easel. Please consider subscribing to my channel, and if you would like immediate notification as to when I upload my fresh videos, then please also remember to just click on the bell icon. So for me to show you the first technique, which is wet on dry, I first need to mix some phthalo blue here. Could be any blue, but I'm going to apply a flat wash. As I say, this particular effect requires a wet on dry application. I'm using a flat brush here, a 1-inch flat brush. So thoroughly mixing the paint up, rolling the brush back and forth to make sure that it's loaded evenly. I've just divided a piece of 15 by 11 watercolour paper up here into 4 sections with masking tape, and I'm just applying one brush stroke at a time from left to right. I'm right-handed, picking up, reloading this blue paint for each pass, so, and overlapping very slightly on each pass also. It's really important to reload the brush for every pass, for every brush stroke. And notice how I'm going from left to right and not stopping. It's a very steady pressure. So keep the pressure the same, keep the speed of the brush stroke the same. That's quite important too. So that is a wet on dry technique, and it will dry out mostly flat. It does vary a little bit depending on conditions and the type of paper that you're using, but that will be mostly flat. And to be honest, a flat mix like that isn't really used that much, maybe in the odd occasion where you have a tropical sky. But what is important is that you get to grips with that particular technique. It's something you must learn in order to understand how paper, paint and water react with each other. Now in this second demonstration, well, I'm starting with the same paint strength. And this again is a wet on dry application. So we're sticking with the wet on dry. I'm now about to show you a graded wash. So we start slightly stronger and darker at the top, and we will eventually weaken off that paint as we move downwards. So you'll see me just going into the black water bucket there that you can just see at the edge of your screen. And it's a drop more water with every pass, and the next couple of passes you'll see it get much lighter. But again, this is still the same technique as the first one, which is wet on dry. We'll just finish it off down here, and I'm not picking up any water at all here. Sorry, any paint at all here. It's just water, and you can see there now that there is a graded look to that wash. So as it dries out, it'll lighten slightly, and you can see the first one on the left in screen, in shot still here, how there's a little variation in some of that, and you know, as I said, it does vary a little bit on drying conditions, drying speeds, and the type of paper that you're using. This is a Bockingford 140 knot surface. I thought I'd show you the palette again here, as I'm just putting out some extra paint. Putting a little bit more of the blue so that we can start with the wash, because I want to show you the next technique, which is wet on wet, or wet in wet. Just putting out a couple of additional colours, that's Payne's Grey and Burnt Sienna, and that'll allow me just to create a nice dark mix to show you just how we go about applying wet paint into an already wet surface. Okay, so we start as we did before. Just going to pick up a bit of blue paint again to get something down on our paper. So I'll do more or less the same as I did on the other two. But I just want to get the surface of the paper covered in quite a watery mix of paper for this particular demonstration. So it's really important to know that with watercolour applied to watercolour paper like this, it sits on the surface for some time, so that I won't be too quick to put the colour that you'll see me doing too quickly. It's just you've got to wait for that paper. A lot of watercolour techniques is to do with timing. It's consistency of paint and timing. And I've mixed a rich mix there of Payne's Grey and Burnt Sienna. And in I come now in a wet and wet. Let's see what happens if I go in now. It's very shiny. And see how this will dissolve. Just hide that. And let's imagine that we want to put a little hillside up here. One brush stroke just to watch, to wait and see. So there's a lot of paint in this brush, but there's also a lot of water. And if we want that misty effect, let's suggest a couple of trees on the horizon just there. And as you can see, the wet paint is drifting into the wet paint. So this fresh application of quite strong paint drifts into the areas that are still wet. And that is the wet and wet. That's what's meant by wet and wet. If I wait a little bit longer and keep the paint strength the same, there'll be less drifting, to a point where it won't drift at all, and it'll become wet on dry. But there are varying degrees, varying stages as this wet paper increasingly dries out and goes through those drying stages. And each time you go into those different stages, you will get a different edge. Very useful. I mean, you can see here that this would make a great water's edge, wouldn't it? You know, this is drifting down. My board is on a 30-degree angle. So if that's the flat of your tabletop, then the angle of my board is something like that. It's about 30 degrees, something like that. But the wet in wet technique is used a lot. Very simple once you get used to it, very effective. Now let's look at dry on wet. Same as I did with the last one. Paint and plenty of water. But this time I'll wait approximately the same length of time as I waited for this one to dry, rather than go straight in where it's still swimming. You've got to remember with the application of a wash like that, it sits on the surface of the paper for a given time. Now that's down to the size, something called the size that's used in the manufacturing of the paper. So it resists, first of all, and it's wrong to go straight in, because as I say that I say it's wrong to go straight in. If you go straight in, you'll get quite a different effect. It'll be closer to this effect because it's still sat on the surface. Everything is still sat on the surface. What I'm doing now is, with this little brush, I'm making sure there's no moisture in there. Then I'm picking up the paint and avoiding contact with any water. So this is almost like mixing glue. When I go in this time, and I think it's just about right now, to know the time of when to go in, it depends on what effect you're trying to achieve. You need to be watching the surface of the paper. In most environments you can see there's enough light for you to see whether there's a sheen still on the surface. If you sort of lean down and look across the surface of the paper, you'll see just how wet or damp it is. Now this paper is drying out, and this is also typical of watercolour paper. If you get some lifting and some buckling in the paper, the likelihood is the areas that are coming up that are lifting will dry out first, and certainly the edges of your paper will dry out first. The only edge that won't dry out as quickly will be the bottom edge. Because of gravity, everything is drifting south and it's staying damp down there. But up here, that'll be the driest area on this piece of paper right now, up here. And then the sides. Then eventually it'll dry out in this sort of inner area. And the last place to dry out will probably be that very bottom edge down here. So this is dry on wet, and dry on damp, dry on wet, varying degrees of. And it will look similar at first to wet in wet, but it's important that you keep this application of paint very rich, very strong. But see how it doesn't move as much as this does. There will be some drifting, some burring at the edge, as you can see here, but it won't move anywhere near as much as this. So more water, more movement. The further that pigment and paint, will travel across the surface. So remember, we applied the same amount of water and paint on this flat surface before we went in with this dark paint. It was just that we went in with a lot stronger. This paint here is a lot stronger. Hence we call this dry on wet. So there's one more technique I want to show you, and that is dry on dry. So the fourth technique is called dry on dry, and as the name suggests, we're working with a brush. We're working with a brush that's been placed in water into the water tub. So you take the brush into the water tub, and then with a tissue get as much of that water out as you can. If we didn't do that, we would have no shape to the brush. Now, as the name suggests, it's dry paint, so even a small amount of water like that there sitting at the edge of these paints would probably be too much. So I'll take, it doesn't matter which colour you pick up first, but we'll pick up a bit of both, sort of equal amount of both. Now here's the thing. This paint is so dry, so sticky, that it won't want to come off the brush. So what you need to do is find the smallest amount of moisture, far less than a teardrop, and that's only so that you can get the paint off the brush. And think of, before I do a little demonstration on this little boat here, and to give you an example where and why we would use the dry brush technique, I'm just going to show you the type of mark it makes. So think that you're drawing, okay? It's as though you're holding a pencil in your hand, and what the dry brush technique delivers is a very hit and miss contact on the surface of the paper. Sometimes more hit than miss, sometimes more miss than hit, but you must keep that dryness in the brush. And interestingly enough, this is the technique that most people paint for quite some time before they're even aware of it. I find, you know, it can make the difference sometimes between. There was a bit more water in that then, so just to let you know, and a bit more there, so you can mix and match it, but just get it back to slightly drier. Just take a tissue and you'll be back to where you started. Yeah, it can make the difference from a sort of the beginner's skill to the more advanced skill. It really is a discipline in that the hand wants to pick up water. I can remember from my school days that whether I was told to do it or not, I don't know, but I did it, and that was every time I picked up paint, I automatically picked up water. And that, if you've developed that habit, is a hard habit to break. And so much so that I had to put a book over my water tub to stop me from doing it for quite a few painting sessions. And interestingly enough, that poor little book that was covering my water tub was peppered and spotted with the amount of times my hand automatically went from the paint to the water. But we got there in the end. So this is a technique that's absolutely essential, and I'm going to show you two of the techniques we've looked at as an example on this little boat here, and it starts with a bit of dry brush. So I'm loading up the brush again with both those two colours, and what we'll do is we'll just put this dry brush mark across here, across the gunnel, the top of this little rowing boat. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a much wetter brush with just a little bit of blue in it. So now we're using the wet on dry technique, and I place the very wet watery blue on the side of this little boat, just deliver it there, get some more water, and this is a really neat little technique. If you just, as I am here, teasing up towards that dry paint, that dry brush line that I made, and just keep teasing at it very, very gently, what you'll see is a drift from that dry paint into the side of the boat. And that will give you a very effective and natural looking boat. And if we take out, this is a bonus tip, if we take out a little bit of that paint from one area of the boat, usually around here where the boat, the shape, the form of that that little boat turns away from the light, or turns into the light often, we just take some paint out there, and that will give that little boat some form. So keep taking it out. So that's one of many instances where we would use the dry on dry, and then followed by immediately followed by wet on dry. I'll just go into the bottom of that boat there. We can dry brush again now, and back to dry brush straight away. And if we want to put the mast in, you're best doing that most of the time with a dry brush. So I've got rid of the water again, and I'm back to where I was when I put the top line of the line at the top of that boat in. And there's a little mast. So you can see just how effective the dry brush technique is. It gives surfaces a bit of a sparkle, like broken light. And when you're dealing with hard surfaces like boats, the top gunnels of boats, the tops of walls, anything anything with a hard, potentially shiny surface, then the dry brush technique is a wonderful technique. And you can even, when you practice this, you can just make a little bit of contact with the point of the brush. You can even put in fine lines like these little ropes and rigging shapes in there. So, just to complete our little scene, we'll go back and use one of the other techniques again. So why don't we do a bit more wet on dry with the large brush, and we'll say perhaps that it's sat on a nice blue, bit of water here. I've left that purposely so we can get a reflection. But what I'll do for that reflection is I'll just take most of the water out of this brush and we'll just drag vertically down to give a nice reflection. And when that dries off a little bit, we can put a reflection of the mast of the boat. So let's have a nice reflection. Off the mast. Something like this. The reflection will probably start about here because we've got to allow for the depth of the boat as a reflection. So this is a very strong mix again, just like we were using on the dry brush edges. And we'll just come down here, give ourselves a reflection. So because that was still damp, this area here, and the mix that I put into the brush was very strong, you can see that there's not a lot of movement, but it does soften the edge, making it look more like a reflection. There we are. Just to recap, so we started off with a flat wash, which was, remember, the technique wet on dry. We then went to a graded wash, which was also wet paint, wet brush on dry paper. Okay. Then this one here was our wet in wet. So we did as we did with the previous two. We picked up a medium strength paint in the brush while this was still wet, and we made a shape to infer that this is a little bit of land, and it left us with these really soft edges. Then we moved over to here where we worked dry into wet. So we had wet on dry, wet on dry, wet into wet, dry into wet, and then we had a little example created here by the use of the fourth technique, dry on dry. So we just did a little practice area of dry on dry. Dry paper, nothing on there, not pre-wetted. The brush is loaded with glue-like dry paint. And then we just did our example of how we would use two of those four techniques that we've looked at. So I hope you find that useful.